Today I'm going to show you how I turned one of my own pieces of artwork into a stained glass panel. Hey y'all, welcome to my channel. Boopity doop! The first step of this process is to actually design the piece. To begin, I traced my drawing and drew in where I thought the pieces of glass should be. I went through a few iterations, finally landing on one that I was happy with. I made a duplicate of my final version so that I would have one to use as a template to lay pieces on as I cut them, and one that I could actually cut up itself and use as stencils for the glass. The next step was to pick colors for the glass. However, there isn't a store near me that sells the stained glass sheets, so instead I bought a bunch of them secondhand from online. It's hard to tell from the pictures on the listings online how exactly the pieces of glass will look, especially in front of a light source, so once they arrived, I held up all of the pieces to a lamp. After I held up all of the pieces to the light, I decided which of the colors I thought might look good together. I looked at my drawings and I identified which pieces should be which colors. Once I decided that, I colored in the drawing to make it more obvious. After labeling all of the pieces on my drawing with which color they would correspond to, I had to cut the pieces. This is why I made a duplicate of my drawing plan. I wanted to cut out all of the pieces of paper to use as stencils to cut the glass. Cutting the paper alone took me almost an hour, so I should have realized at this point just how long this project was going to take. I'd sorted all of the template pieces based on the color of glass they corresponded to, and then I carefully traced each one onto the glass pane. Something I learned from the first two pieces of stained glass that I made is that a thicker marker is better than a thin since it doesn't rub off as easily, and that I need to trace as close to the template as possible to make the cutting more accurate. The more accurate the cutting, the less time that you need to spend grinding the pieces later. Another thing that's important here is actually how you lay out the pieces on the glass itself. When you score and cut the glass, it tends to want to break in a relatively straight line, so you can't arrange your pieces to where they'll break into each other. The next step after tracing the stencils is to cut the pieces out of the glass. Here you can see I'm using a glass cutter to score the glass. The glass cutter that I bought and I'm using here is pretty nice because it stores the lubricating oil in the handle, and as you push down on the blade, it actually dispenses the oil onto the glass. Once you score the glass, you have to use pliers to snap the glass along the score line. Two types of pliers that you typically use in this process. The green-handled pair that you can see me using are called running pliers. These pliers put pressure on both sides of the score and break it along the run. These work really well, but only if the glass is wide enough to span the width of the pliers. The other type of pliers that I used, which you can see here is having blue handles, are called Grozer pliers. They're an asymmetric pair of pliers which can be used to snap the glass along the score by pulling down and away, and you can also use them to nibble away little pieces of the glass. After cutting the pieces, the next step is to grind them and make them fit together accurately. In order to do this, I use a grinder that's specifically made for glass. During this process of cutting and grinding the glass, you might notice that I actually changed some of my pieces. Some of the ones in my initial design were so thin that every time I tried to cut them out, I would accidentally break them, and I was getting a bit frustrated. In the end, with Tiffany-style stained glass, what holds all the pieces together is solder. The solder won't stick to the glass itself though, so you actually have to line each side of the glass pieces with copper foil tape. But you can't line them with copper foil tape until everything is cleaned up. Next, I wiped down each piece of glass with rubbing alcohol to clean it up, and I was careful to wipe down the edges really well so that the copper foil tape would adhere properly. After that, I started putting the copper foil tape around the edge of each piece. To do this, you first have to wrap the piece with the copper foil tape, making sure the tape is centered on the edge. After doing that, you have to fold the copper foil tape over the surface of the glass. Once it's folded over, it's still pretty bumpy, so you have to burnish it to get it smooth and to be well adhered. You can see that this is a pretty time-intensive process. On average, I would say it would take between 30 seconds and a minute per piece, depending on the size and shape of the piece. I have over 100 pieces at this point, so you can tell this is probably going to take me a while. After I finished prepping all of these pieces, I went back to cutting and grinding, and I made some simple green triangles for the corners. At this point, everything was actually starting to look better than I expected, and I started getting excited that maybe this piece would look pretty good. I'm still not any sort of stained glass expert, as this is only my third attempt, and everything I've learned has been from YouTube and the internet. I laid out all of my pieces, and it was time to attach them together with the solder. For this, I used a 6040 tin lead solder that's 3mm in diameter, and I used liquid flux. The flux is necessary to get the solder to stick to the copper foil. I started off by soldering the backside, so I flipped all of my pieces over. My reasoning for this was it would give me a chance to practice soldering on the side that wouldn't be seen, and it would also ensure that the front side was completely flat. Since I bought the pieces of glass secondhand, not all of them were the same exact thickness, so by flipping it over, I also thought it would create a more level surface for the front side. However, one thing that I didn't realize was that I was using a little bit too much liquid flux, so that when I went to solder the front side, there was too much liquid flux caught in the cracks between the pieces, and it had nowhere to escape when it vaporized, and it caused the solder to bubble quite a bit. I had to go back over and re-smooth out my solder lines quite a bit. For the soldering process, I initially tacked all the pieces together with dots of solder and then tinned the seams. Tinning the seams means that I add a very small layer of solder, just enough to cover everything. Once it's all adhered, what I did was I went back and I beaded with the solder. This is the thicker layer that you put on the seams. If you just leave it tinned, the seams wouldn't be very strong, and it wouldn't look like the typical Tiffany stained glass. I did this for both the back and front sides. For the edge, there's two choices. You can either solder the boulder, creating a bead around the edge, or you can use U-shaped hobbycam. Hobbycam is a lead channel that you can use and fold around the glass. I forgot to record this part, but I did use the hobbycam, and since it's flexible, I just worked it around the whole piece. I decided to use a black patina. What this does is it changes the color of the solder to a black color. However, it only works if the solder is really clean. Right after soldering, the piece was quite dirty. It was covered in flux and a little bit of solder splatter. I thoroughly cleaned it with dish soap, and I scrubbed all of the solder lines with a rough kitchen sponge, then with steel wool. I applied the patina and it instantly changed the color of the solder to black. I think it looks really nice and it makes the colors of the peacock really pop. After applying the patina, I waxed the glass. Here's the end result. I'm really happy with how this turned out, and I learned so much making this. In the future, I'm going to make more stained glass. I'm hoping to start making some three-dimensional stained glass pieces. This is my first time posting a video other than a short on YouTube, and my first time ever doing a voiceover. If you watched this entire video, thank you so much. Please leave a nice comment if you liked it.